your chance to have your say. So just a quick disclaimer ahead of this video, I've sectioned it off into almost three different sections. The first section is going to be looking at practice and qualifying data, and then the next section is going to be looking at the race data, and then the final section is going to be looking at my driver of the day rankings based on the data presented in this video. So the bit that I am most proud of and the bit that I would really like you to see and comment on is the race progression data. But if you want to sit through all of it, then please by all means do that. But I will leave little timestamps and a contents page type of thing so you can skip to whichever section you would like. But with that out of the way, enjoy the video. Hello, my name is Alex Does F1 Stuff and welcome back to another random F1 episode, but today is slightly different. I'm going to be running a small little pilot series. And this pilot series I think is going to be called the data analysis, or the data analysis of a particular Grand Prix, and we are going to be looking at some of the 2020 data. And the reason I'm calling this a pilot series is because what you're about to see is nowhere near the finished product. I would like your input on what you would like to see in terms of particular data sets, things that I could do, or improvements for what I've already got in mind and what you're about to see in today's video. And today we are looking at Austria and the race weekend's data analysis for the Austrian Grand Prix of 2020. With the idea of this pilot series being me able to iron out all of the creases that I would have done in the first couple of episodes of 2021, I want to be able to nail this series for 2021 and not have to make any changes throughout the year. I want to be able to get all of that out of the way beforehand. I want to fix up all of my Excel spreadsheets so it just outputs exactly what I want straight away, so I don't have to waste time when the season starts fiddling with all of the data. So I want to run through a couple races in the 2020 season and get your guys' opinion and your guys' interpretations and own input into this series to try and make it as best as possible ahead of 2021. So let's jump straight on in then, shall we? And we start with the race weekend progression. This is very similar to category number 3 of my determining the best driver of 2020. And we start with the Austria progression from practice 1, 2 and 3 through to qualifying 1, 2 and 3. We can map on Lewis Hamilton's time and also Valtteri Bottas's times through the weekend as well. And therefore from that we can map on everybody else. The Ferraris, the McLarens, the Renaults, the Racing Points, the Alfa Tauris, the Alfa Romeos, the Haases, and finally the Williams with Nicholas Latifi miles behind everybody. And then from this I can take the team's fastest lap time regardless of which driver set it, and I can create a graph that looks like this, slightly more detailed as there are only just 10 lines compared to 20. Now, at this moment in time, I'm not 100% sure where to take this just yet, but what I have done is looking at the right-hand side graph, I have been able to work out each team's progression from session to session, and it looks something like this. So FP1 to FP2, the team that most improved was Ferrari, just by 0.02 of a second ahead of Alfa Tauri, ahead of Racing Point, then a little step down to Alfa Romeo, and an even bigger step down to Renault. And then we've got FP2 to FP3 with Racing Point and Alfa Romeo losing time. Then we've got FP3 to Q1 with Mercedes only gaining 0.02 of a second. We've then got Q1 to Q2 where Mercedes gained over a second. And then finally Q2 to Q3. Now honestly this data is a little bit I'm not 100% sure where to go with it, so if you've got any ideas of what else you could see with the driver improvements, then please let me know in the comments. However, something that I have done, or something that I could definitely do, is break it down into teammate battles instead. So we've got Mercedes first, and we'll just pull up the Mercedes progression. So this is just Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton. This spread is about 3.4 seconds, I believe, or 2.4 seconds even. And you can see the detail a lot more clearly here. And then on the right, we've just got the gaps to each driver in each session. Lewis Hamilton in the black and Valtteri Bottas in the turquoise. Now, unfortunately, as this is only round 1, I can't really do any plots because I could do positional plots in FP1, FP2, FP3, Q1, Q2, and Q3 of exactly where each driver lies. So I could do something like that, but I can't really do that with just one race. I'd have to do it for episode number 2 of this little pilot series. But then I could also do like an average gap, possibly, if that's something you want to see, or maybe difference to your average position, which again I'm unable to do from just round number 1, as can't really get averages from just one race's worth of data. However, I have applied exactly this strategy or this pro forma to each other team. So we've got Red Bull up next, and you can see their progression here, with Alex Albon just beating Max Verstappen in Q2, with their gaps looking like this. And then, of course, we've got McLaren also, that were actually really close throughout this session, with the gaps looking a bit like this. Lando Norris getting the better of Carlos Sainz in the blue. And then we've got Racing Point, who again were fairly close. Lance Stroll only beating Sergio Perez just once, with gaps that look a little bit like this. And then in the midfield, we've got Renault P5, with Esteban Ocon just beating Daniel Ricciardo once in FP3, with gaps of this, just half a tenth in it in FP3 between the two Renaults. And then we've got Ferrari, again, actually a lot closer than people first think. Sebastian Vettel was doing really well in the first half of the season, with gaps that look a little bit like this. And then we have Alfa Tauri with, I don't know how to really describe that. Again, it's a little bit close. I think a lot closer than people first imagine, with gaps very similar to the Ferrari gaps. Then we have Alfa Romeo, with Giovinazzi actually beating Kimi Raikkonen in every single session, only just by 0.005 of a second in FP1. Then penultimately, we've got Haas up next, which look a bit like this. Romain Grosjean missing FP1 and starting in FP2, so there was no gap to take from FP1. 0.2 ahead in FP2 for Grosjean, but almost 0.3 ahead for Magnussen in FP3. And then finally, we have Williams, which is this massive chasm between the two drivers, which we definitely know about. And it was a 1.4 second gap between George Russell's FP3 time and Nicholas Latifi's FP3 time. So that's what I have so far for the driver progression, just looking at the practice data and the qualifying data. But if you think it's better for me to split it up into a practice, or I could just ignore practice, I'm not 100% sure, or I could just look at qualifying, or if you want me to include both of them, I can split them up. I don't know just yet. I think possibly splitting them up could be worth it actually. So we look at practice first, we plot their FP1, FP2, FP3 positions and all their average times and things like that. Maybe do like a head-to-head battle, something like that. So how many times each driver outperforms the other in FP1, FP2 and FP3, and then copy that process for qualifying as well, and then seeing how they stack up over each of the sessions. So Friday being practice and then Saturday being qualifying. That might be worth doing. But now we will jump on into some race data, and this is what I have worked on quite a lot. So we begin with the positions chart. Now again, if you've watched a few of my videos, positions charts are very common, and this is the one for Austria. Unfortunately, if we look at the far right hand side, it doesn't equate for the penalty that pushed Hamilton back to P4 or P5, allowing Lando Norris to secure a podium. This is their on-track finishing positions. However, we can take it a step further and we can look at each lap time chart, and it looks something like this. However, it is very tall, as it is skewed massively by Max Verstappen's DNF, 138 second lap, and also 2 safety car periods, which are very clearly outlined here. So what I can do with this is I can zoom in on just the section of actual green flag racing, and it looks something a little like this. This is just a section of 6 seconds worth of racing, and you can see it comes in 3 separate stages. We've got the first stage all the way on the left, then we have the first safety car, then we have a middle portion of the race, then we have the second safety car, and then we have the final portion of the race. But very interestingly, we can see different bands of racing. So if we go to the first section of this race, we can highlight bands number 1, which are just the 2 Mercedes. And for the first 10 laps, Max Verstappen and sort of Alex Albon are in there as well, but they definitely fall back into the second group of racing, which is just above them here. And then we have, it's a little harder to see as it definitely merges into 3 near the end, but we do have a third group, and then finally we have a fourth group just at the top here. And these same groups are translated once again into the middle portion, with the green at the bottom being just the 2 Mercedes this time, the second group highlighted in blue being a mixture of other drivers, and then the yellow is also the drivers further back, with the green being the 2 Williams cars. However, interestingly, at the very end, the last section of this race, it is split into 3. We have the fastest set of cars, which is again the 2 Mercedes and Max Verstappen as well. We have a larger middle group of cars, and then finally we have the third group here. Now, this is the kind of data that I expect to see in pretty much every race. You obviously don't get very consistent racing. If I was to look at this for an F2 sort of race, it would definitely be one consistent line of all the different drivers. However, in Formula 1, we do see this breakup of individual bands of racing. It's very interesting to see 4 of them, in my opinion, as you expect to see 3. You've got the front runners, as in the 2 Mercedes and the 2 Red Bulls, and then you have the midfield, which is basically everybody else, and then you have the bottom 3, which is Haas, Alfa Romeo and Williams. So it is very interesting to see 4, as the midfield almost gets split up into 2 groups. So if we can trace this through the season, I can probably do something, I'm not quite sure just yet, but it's very cool to highlight these areas. Especially as we don't really see lap time charts. Not many people seem to publish them, at least not that I've seen, and I try and find all of this kind of data as I want to see how other people have done it, and it's just very interesting to see. However, like we did with the practice progression data, I am definitely 100% splitting this up into teammate battles. So we start with Mercedes, and we can pull up the Mercedes lap time chart just looking at the 2 drivers. So we can fill in Lewis Hamilton in the black line, with the 2 almost vertical lines being the 2 safety car periods, with the first vertical line around lap 3 being the slow first and second laps up to racing speed, and then we can map on Valtteri Bottas and you can see where they matched each other and where each driver was going faster. And then from this graph I can work out the gaps that they had. So Bottas was always leading, as we saw in the positions chart at the very beginning of this segment. So how far ahead was Bottas in each particular section? I can map this onto this graph here, and it looks a little something like this. And then just in the top right, I can map on that positions chart, and you can sort of see already the period of laps 1 to 25 on the gaps chart, the nice arch, sort of correlates to Lewis Hamilton being P5 fighting his way back to P2. So he's losing time to Valtteri Bottas, who's consistently running in P1, but once he gets to P2, he holds that ground from lap 25 all the way to the end of the race. And then something that I did spend quite a while working on and changing a lot is this graph here, the percentage pace difference from Hamilton to Bottas. So what this graph does is it lines up every single lap in order that they go in, and then it takes the difference of each of those drivers, the 2 teammates. For example, if on lap 1, Valtteri Bottas set a 75-second lap, but Lewis Hamilton set a 78-second lap, the pace difference percentage would be the 75 over 78, and it would be in favour of Valtteri Bottas, as he would be the faster driver. And then simply once I've worked out all of those percentages, I can then order the percentages from Hamilton's fastest one being 100 and something, down to Valtteri Bottas being faster, which is about 94. And then going back to the graph, we can map it on, and it looks a bit like this for Lewis Hamilton, and then we've got times where Valtteri Bottas was faster just here. And you can see if we split this line down the middle here, we have just 50.7% of the laps in favour of Valtteri Bottas. So Valtteri Bottas was faster than Lewis Hamilton for 50.7 laps. And then we've got 49.3% of the laps being faster for Lewis Hamilton. However, this is more due to the fact that there was an odd number of laps. If there was 72 laps and Lewis Hamilton just happened to be faster, this would have been dead 50-50. So this is as close to 50-50 as you can be. However, what we can now do is we can interpret the 2 graphs on the left. So I can highlight this section here between the 2 blue arrows, where Valtteri Bottas is clearly going faster than Lewis Hamilton. This correlates to this section on the bottom graph between the blue arrows, where he extends his lead from 4 seconds to just under 8 seconds. However, in between the 2 blue arrows, we have this section here, where Lewis Hamilton is almost matched to Valtteri Bottas, and this equates to this small horizontal section of Bottas's improvement time here, where the gap basically stayed at around 6 seconds. And then the next section that we can look at is this one here, in between the 2 yellow arrows, and this is where Lewis Hamilton was clearly going faster, which correlates to this section of the graph down below, which is clearly the gap coming down in Lewis Hamilton's favour. And then we have this 4th highlight here in red, which is where they are both basically equal. Not much is really happening, and that is shown just down here, where the gap is hovering around 1 second, between 2 and 1 seconds. And this is then basically copied over on the far right hand side, where again the gap just fluctuates between 2.5 and less than a second gap. And then finally we have these two peaks here, which are pit stops for Lewis Hamilton first, and these correlate exactly to the safety car period. So this is the type of data analysis that I will go into for this series, but if there are any corrections that you would like me to make or any improvements that you would like to see, please let me know down in the comments below. But then applying all of this data here to Red Bull, we end up with a sheet that looks a bit like this. Now unfortunately, because Max Verstappen retired so early on, there isn't really much to show on this one. However, all we can look at is on the percentage pace difference graph. We can draw a vertical line here and show that 9.1% of the laps where they were both on the track went towards Alex Albon, and that just so happened to be the lap that Max Verstappen retired. And then we've got 90.9 in favour of Max Verstappen. And so moving on to McLaren, which is the next very interesting one here, we have a section of the graph between the two blue arrows where clearly Lando Norris is the faster of the McLaren driver for roughly about 20 laps, which correlates to these two blue lines here, where it's a nice consistent increase in time from about just below 4 seconds to roughly 8 seconds. However, just before that, we have this green arrow here, where Carlos Sainz ends up going a lot faster than Lando Norris, and that is this small little divot in the graph here. So just to the left of the green arrow on the lap chart, Lando Norris went a lot faster, and that equates to the first peak just before the left arrow on the gaps chart. And then between the two yellow arrows we have this section here, which is again Lando Norris going a bit faster than Carlos Sainz, and that equates once again to this second increase in time after the safety car period where they were brought together, which is the sharp decrease in the McLaren gap, and then it gently increases again with Lando Norris going a bit quicker. And then of course we've got this gap here, which actually lines up on the top right hand graph to the only period in the race where Carlos Sainz was ahead of Lando Norris. And then of course looking towards the percentage pace difference graph, we can split this in half and say that 20.1% of the laps where they raced against each other were in favour of Carlos Sainz, compared to 78.9% in favour of Lando Norris. And then we move on into Racing Point, and again this is very similar to Red Bull. Unfortunately there's not a great deal that I can actually pull from this. So if we just move to the percentage pace difference graph, we can see that again there is just 5% of the laps where they were both on track together that were in favour of Lance Stroll, and 95% of the laps were in favour of Sergio Perez. And then moving from the Pink Panthers, we head over to Renault, and once again it is very similar, as a lot of the teammates ended up retiring in this race. We had like 8 or 9 retirements, and they were all very quick and very early on, so unfortunately there's not a lot of data that I can pull, as not a lot of the teammates made it very far into the race together. But once again, I can split the percentage pace difference graph up down the middle, and we have 11.8% of the laps where they raced together, the Renault teammates going towards Esteban Ocon, compared to 88.2% of the laps going towards Daniel Ricciardo. However, moving to the more interesting team, we head to Ferrari. Now this is very similar to the McLaren one. So we have the first section between the two blue lines, which shows clearly for the first 25, 26 sort of laps, Charles Leclerc, I was about to say Lando Norris, but Charles Leclerc is faster than Sebastian Vettel, which equates to this nice steady increase from around 1 to 2 seconds to about 15. However, this green line here just represents the first safety car that was called, and therefore his 15-second gap was sliced, and it went all the way down to practically nothing, as if we look at the positions chart, they were only separated by about 2 positions throughout this race. And then the next section to look at is between the two yellow lines in between the two safety cars, which again is shown just here with the nice steady increase from around 10 seconds after the first safety car to just over 30 seconds ahead for Charles Leclerc. However, there is once again a second safety car, and this gap is sliced all the way down to just under 5 seconds. And then again, we can split the pace percentage difference across the middle, and we can see that 14.1% of the laps were in favour of Sebastian Vettel, compared to 85.9% in favour of Charles Leclerc. And leaving Ferrari, we can head on in to Alfa Tauri. Now this is a very interesting panel that we can highlight and analyse here. So the first section between the two blue arrows is again just before the first safety car, and Danny Kvyat and Pierre Gasly were exceptionally even, and that correlates to this section here where the gap was just staying between 2 seconds and 4 seconds. It really wasn't wavering between that gap at all. There is then the mid-section of the race, which is just between the two safety cars, which again, they are very, very even. And this is shown just here. There is perhaps a section of the race where Pierre Gasly manages to creep that gap up closer to 4 seconds, whereas Danny Kvyat managed to keep it at around just under 2 seconds at the beginning, but they were still very, very even. However, then comes the final sprint finish, and that is highlighted just here with the green sort of arrow, and there is an enormous pace difference between the two drivers, and that is shown by this steep incline in the gap. From again, where it has constantly been this whole race between 2 and 4 seconds, it rose all the way to just below 10 in the final 10 laps. Then once again we have the two peaks of the two pit stops lining up with the safety car window, in which Danny Kvyat lost considerable amount of time towards Pierre Gasly. And then again we can split up the percentage pace difference graph down the middle, and we can see that 42.2% of the laps were in favour of Danny Kvyat, and 57.8% of the laps were in favour of Pierre Gasly. And when I say in favour, I just simply mean that Pierre Gasly was going faster in the race for 57.8% of the laps compared to Danny Kvyat. And then heading now to Alfa Romeo, we have this very similar looking graph just here. So we've got the first section that we can highlight where they were very, very even, and that correlates to this first little white line here, the gap staying between 0 and 3 seconds. But even though this gap was just between 0 and 3 seconds, there was an enormous gulf between their positions chart. There was about 4 positions between the two cars, and maybe 3 or maybe even 2 positions between this period of laps. Even though they had such a close gap, there was so many cars between them, just showing that they were definitely stuck in a train. But then highlighting this section here in yellow, we can see that Kimi Räikkönen was massively faster than Antonio Giovinazzi. And this highlights here in the section where Kimi Räikkönen was actually faster, and he was the one that had a gap over Antonio Giovinazzi, which is shown in their positions chart between laps 17 and around laps 23 to 25. And then once again we have a section in the middle of the race until Kimi Räikkönen's retirement where they were very, very even, which once again the gap is lasting between 0 and 3 seconds. And then again we have the two peaks corresponding to the two safety car periods where Kimi Räikkönen loses a lot of time. In the first safety car instance he lost 20 seconds to Antonio Giovinazzi. And then of course we can split up the pace percentage difference graph down the middle, and for the laps where they were both consecutively running, it was 50.9% in favour of Giovinazzi and 40.1% or 49.1% in favour of Kimi Räikkönen. That should be 49, not 40. And then penultimately we head on in to Haas. Now again, this isn't one that we can take a great deal from, as Magnussen retired very early on, and then even Grosjean retired halfway through this race also. But we can highlight a small section here where Magnussen is just going a little bit quicker than Romain Grosjean, which is highlighted in this nice shallow increase here. However, very interestingly, just before the first safety car between these two yellow lines, Romain Grosjean comes into the pits or has an issue or something along those lines, which loses him an enormous amount of time, which is this huge steep increase, and this is before the first safety car. The first safety car came just after the second yellow arrow in the laps chart, around laps 25 to 27, but there is definitely a first peak before this safety car, which is where Magnussen gained so much time over Grosjean. And then again, splitting up the percentage pace difference graph, we can see that 25% exactly of the laps where they were running consecutively were in favour of Romain Grosjean, compared to 75% in favour of Kevin Magnussen. And then finally we have Williams here, and again this isn't one that we can take a great deal from, but we have the first section between the two blue lines where George Russell was roughly just going a little bit quicker than Nicholas Latifi, which is correspondent to this blue line or blue arrows here. And then we have the second section of the race, which is between these two yellow arrows, where again George Russell is just about going quicker than Nicholas Latifi, which corresponds to these two yellow arrows here, with the gap staying around 15 to 20 seconds. But But very interestingly, there are actually two peaks here, or a peak and a trough. So the first trough in the sort of red looking line is where George Russell loses a whole bunch of time. The gap comes down to about 0.2 seconds around lap 26, but then it increases massively to 60 seconds, over a minute, a couple of laps later. And again, that is due to the safety car and the way that teammates come into the pits and all sorts of things like that. But again, just moving over to the percentage pace difference graph, we can split this down the middle, and for the laps that both cars were running, 18.3% of them were in favour of Nicholas Latifi, compared to 81.7% in favour of Russell. Now that is the section of the data analysis that I am so far most proud of. This is what I really like to do, and this is what I love spending my time doing. So if you guys have got any improvements for what you would like to see in this section, or how I can improve it, please do let me know in the comments below. But there is of course more data that we can go through. So I have very quickly just drawn up some of the pit stops, and the pit stops made per team. So Mercedes made 4, Red Bull made 3, McLaren 6, etc, and then the line above them just shows their fastest pit stop time. Now unfortunately, the place where I grab all of my data from and where I import it all into my own Excel spreadsheets don't have the stationary pit stop. This is the full length from where they enter the pit stop limiter across the first pit stop line to where they turn off their pit stop limiter. So we can see that Mercedes had the fastest pit stop time overall, just 7/10 faster than Red Bull, but of course I can split this up into the drivers, and we can see that both Mercedes made 2 pit stops, both McLarens made 3, both Ferraris made 3, and it was again the 2 Mercedes who had the fastest pit stop time, only just, as Sergio Perez was a 10th behind Valtteri Bottas. And then from this graph, I can order them in a fastest pit stop time or something like that. It's not really ideal, as it's not physically the fastest pit stop, as it has some element of unsafe release or driver error or something like that, where they don't quite maximize the pit entrance, so it incorporates everything, so it's not quite a fastest pit stop time. I'm not sure if this data is really relevant, but that's why this is a pilot series. But then, very interestingly, what I would really like to do is a driver of the day. However, not include any of my own opinions. I want to look at all of the data and come to a conclusion based on numerous categories. So this is exceptionally similar, and in fact, I've actually pinched my own data categories from my determining the best driver of 2020. So we are going to be looking at the driver progression categories, excluding the individual ones, as I don't have any average data, as this is race 1 effectively, so I won't have any average data for the remainder of the season. So it will have to be purely based off of your performance against your teammate. But again, as it's happening to everyone, I don't feel anyone is being unfairly disadvantaged or advantaged. But then as the season progresses and I do get average data, I can 100% include that to include a individual sort of performance category. So the first category that we will look at for determining the driver of the day for Austria is the driver progression. And what I've got on screen now is the gaps to your teammate. So the top left graph is the FP1 gaps to your teammate. So Sergio Perez was just over half a tenth faster than Lance Stroll, with Lance Stroll being just over half a tenth down. And I've ordered these gaps from the fastest gap or the largest gap to the smallest gap. And then Grosjean and Magnussen don't have a gap, as Grosjean didn't partake in practice 1. And then I've done the same for FP2, FP3, Q1, and then of course we've got Q2 and Q3. Now each of these orders from left to right will receive a rank, and if they do happen to have the same gap to their teammate, they will receive joint ranks. Those joint ranks for the 5 categories will be averaged out, and then I will have an overall rank for your driver progression category. And then the second category I can look at is your race progression. And again, this is pinched directly from part number 4 of my post-season series. And if we look here, this is the lap 1 data for Austria. So this is the lap times that everyone set on lap number 1. I can work out the difference to your teammate on each of these laps. So Lewis Hamilton was just over 4 seconds down on Valtteri Bottas, and Valtteri Bottas was just over 4 seconds up. I can then rank each of these differences from largest down to smallest, and we end up with something that looks a bit like this. And these are your ranks on lap number 1. I can then apply this exact data set all through the 71 laps of the race, and then I can average out each of the 71 categories as well. For the drivers that end up retiring and therefore don't have a gap, they will not receive a rank and will therefore only be ranked on the laps that they have a difference to your teammate. So again, people that retire are not unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged. And then applying this across all 71 laps of the race and then averaging all of those 71 categories, we end up with this order here. Charles Leclerc was declared the best, then Sergio Perez, Norris, Ricciardo were joint on 3, and then Magnussen and Russell were joint on 5, with 3 drivers joint on 7, 4 joint on 10, and so on and so forth down to Ocon. And then the final category that I can have a look at as well is the percentage pace difference. So if you remember the way that we split up the percentage pace difference and declared how many laps faster percentage-wise each teammate was, I can take all of those percentages and order them, and we end up with a graph that looks like this. Sergio Perez was the most dominant teammate over Lance Stroll, with 95% of the laps that they completed together going towards Sergio Perez, and so on and so forth all the way down the order. And then once again, I can give ranks to these drivers, 1 through to 20 from left to right. Any joint percentages will be given a joint rank. I can then average all of those 3 categories, the race progression, the driver progression through practice and qualifying, and then this final percentage pace difference. So that is 3 overall categories to give a rank to, and I can come up with an overall driver of the day. And so the overall driver of the day for Austria, according to those 3 categories, which look primarily at your battles against your teammate in 3 different categories across the whole weekend, is this here. We have Lando Norris ahead of Sergio Perez, ahead of Charles Leclerc, Valtteri Bottas, Daniel Ricciardo, then Verstappen, Hamilton, Gasly, Magnussen, Russell, Vettel, Giovinazzi, Kvyat, Grosjean, Sainz, Stroll, Raikkonen, Albon, Latifi, and Ocon. Now, obviously, this doesn't account for anything that really happens in the race. This doesn't account for super overtakes or my own opinion on how each driver fared. This is just looking at the data. So I've chosen 3 of those categories to look at, and like I said, round number 1, they will be based heavily off of battles against your teammate, because simply round number 1, I do not have any average data to make, but after round number 2, I will, and therefore I can make different averages across the year, and they will change throughout your positions in FP1, FP2, FP3, so I can work out those average positions and how far ahead or behind you are to work out your own individual performance, and then it will become more 50-50. So there we go, that is the first episode of this little pilot series all done and dusted. If you have any of your own ideas for anything that's happened in this video, please let me know in the comments below. I know it's been a bit of a long one, but this is the type of thing that I'm going to aim for 2021 in replace of some of my race reviews. Definitely the pre-race review, I think that's going to go. I think also the speed review as well, and I might just do my own opinion on people's races, and then of course I will do this data analysis series. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.